The war was ending, but the dying never stopped. In the spring of 1945, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities lay open like wounds. The air smelled of burned iron and wet stone, and the rivers carried the ashes of nations. The Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own madness. Yet in the mountains of Western Austria, small pockets of resistance still fought as if the dream of victory could be resurrected with a few more corpses. The people who lived in those valleys, farmers, carpenters, widows, had stopped believing in sides. They only wanted the shooting to stop. In one of those valleys stood a castle that looked as if it had been carved out of the rock itself. Castle Itter rose above the Tyrolean town like a crown of gray stone, its towers cutting through mist and rain. For centuries, it had been home to nobles, priests, and merchants. Now it belonged to the SS. Behind its medieval walls was a prison unlike any other in Hitler's empire, a place for France's most valuable captives. Inside were men who had once ruled a country. Édouard Daladier, the prime minister who had shaken Hitler's hand at Munich. Paul Reynaud, who had replaced him and watched France fall. General Maurice Gamelin, who had commanded the French army in 1940 and failed to stop the German blitzkrieg. General Maxime Weygand, his rival and successor. François Delaroque, the right-wing nationalist who had once dreamed of power. And Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, once adored in Parisian stadiums, now pacing a cold stone courtyard. They had little in common except defeat. The SS called them honor prisoners. In reality, they were hostages, pieces on a board Hitler no longer cared to play. The guards at Castle Itter treated them with calculated indifference. Orders came from Dachau, but no one knew why the prisoners were kept alive. The war was ending, and logic had long ago deserted the Reich. The prisoners passed their days with routine that barely masked despair. They argued about politics in whispers, wrote imaginary letters to wives and children, and stared at the mountains through barred windows. At night, they could hear distant thunder, sometimes real storms, sometimes artillery. They did not know which frightened them more. Reynaud often muttered that when the end came, it would come without warning. Daladier, who still carried the guilt of Munich like a brand on his soul, would answer, "We all made peace with monsters. Now we live among them." By May, the sound of war grew closer. The SS garrison had thinned to a handful of men. Supplies were low. Rumors spread through the castle like fever. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Americans were days away. But what terrified them most was another rumor, that the SS planned to execute all high-profile prisoners before surrendering. They had seen it happen elsewhere. They knew what the end of empires looked like. Then, on the night of May 3rd, something strange happened. The commandant of Castle Itter vanished. He gathered his staff, loaded a truck with food and rifles, and drove into the darkness. When the prisoners awoke the next morning, they found the gates open, the guard towers empty. The silence was worse than gunfire. Jean Borotra was the first to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing across the courtyard, "it appears we are free." But none of them believed it. The valley below was still full of soldiers, and not all of them had accepted defeat. SS units were known to kill their own comrades for talking of surrender. Freedom without protection was suicide. They gathered in the dining hall to decide their fate. It was a strange council. Former prime ministers, generals, a tennis player, a priest. Old arguments resurfaced even here, but fear united them. Someone had to go for help. None of them could risk leaving on foot. They would be recognized or shot. But the Yugoslav handyman, Andreas Krobat, a silent man who had worked in the stables, stepped forward. "I will go," he said in broken German. "I know the road. Maybe I find Americans." At dawn, Krobat took a battered bicycle, wrapped a white cloth around his arm, and rode out of the gate. The prisoners watched from the battlements until the fog swallowed him. For a while they stood there, uncertain whether to hope or pray. Then they returned to their posts and waited. In the town of Virgil, 12 kilometers away, Major Joseph Gong was also waiting. For orders, for meaning, for the war to end. Gong commanded a small artillery unit of the Wehrmacht, but his allegiance to the Reich had dissolved months ago. He had seen too many civilians executed by the SS, too many boys sent to die for nothing. He and his men had begun secretly cooperating with the Austrian resistance, hiding food and protecting villagers. Every act of mercy was treason, but Gong no longer cared. When the Yugoslav arrived, drenched in sweat and mud, the major listened to his story with disbelief. A castle full of French VIPs, abandoned by their SS guards, threatened with execution if discovered. It sounded absurd, but the man's desperation was unmistakable. Gong stood silent for a long moment, then said, "We will help them." His sergeant stared at him. "Herr Major, the Americans will shoot us on sight." "Then we will go to them first," Gong said, "and we will tell them the truth." That truth would create one of the strangest alliances in military history. Gong gathered 10 of his most trusted men, soldiers who were tired of killing. They mounted a captured truck and flew a white flag from its antenna. The Yugoslav sat beside him, clutching a pistol he barely knew how to use. As they drove west, the air was thick with smoke and the stench of surrender. Villages burned in the distance. Columns of German soldiers trudged toward captivity, their eyes hollow. On the outskirts of Kufstein, the truck was stopped by a patrol of the U.S. 12th Armored Division. The Americans raised their rifles, shouting for the Germans to get up with their hands up. Gong obeyed. He stepped forward, saluted awkwardly, and in rough English said, "We come not to fight. We come to ask for help." The Americans hesitated. Then Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr. appeared, a compact man with a quick temper and an instinct for impossible missions. He listened as Gong explained, haltingly, earnestly, about the castle, the prisoners, the threat of the SS. Lee frowned. "You're telling me you want us to fight your own people?" Gong met his eyes. "They are not my people anymore." Lee thought for a long moment, then spat into the dust. "All right," he said, "let's go get your castle." That night, under a low ceiling of clouds, the strangest convoy of the war rolled out of Virgil. 14 American soldiers and 2 jeeps and a Sherman tank, 10 German volunteers, and 1 Yugoslav messenger who had already defied death once. The tank's name, painted in white on its armor, was Besotten Jenny. It led the way up the narrow mountain road, its engine growling in the dark. The road twisted through forests that smelled of rain and smoke. Every bend could hide an ambush. The men spoke little. Inside the tank, the crew passed a chocolate bar between them, the first they had tasted in weeks. In the jeep behind them, Gangel sat beside Lee, scanning the shadows for movement. "The SS won't surrender," he said quietly. "They would rather die than admit defeat." Lee nodded. "Then we'll help them with that." At midnight, the convoy reached the base of the hill. The castle loomed above them, black against the lighter clouds. For a moment, no one moved. Then the gate creaked open, and figures appeared with lanterns, thin, cautious, frightened. The French prisoners had seen the headlights and feared it was the SS. Now, as the light fell across the white star on the tank, they stared in disbelief. "Americans," whispered Barotra. "Mon Dieu, they're Americans." The convoy rolled into the courtyard. Soldiers dismounted, weapons ready, scanning the shadows. Lee climbed out of the jeep and looked up at the fortress walls. "Hell of a place," he muttered. "Let's make sure we keep it." The prisoners surrounded him, talking at once, French, German, English, overlapping. Lee raised a hand. "Slow down. We're here to help, but the SS will be here soon. We need to get ready." Barotra grinned, clapping his hands. At last, some real sport. By dawn, they had turned the castle into a fortress again. Sandbags at the gate, rifles in the towers, the tank positioned as a barricade. It was madness, a handful of men preparing to defend a medieval ruin against an entire SS battalion. But no one questioned it. In a war where every cause had lost its meaning, this one felt simple. Protect the innocent, hold the line, do what was right. And as the first light touched the Alps, they heard it. The distant rattle of machine guns, the howl of engines climbing the valley road. The SS had found them. The first bullets struck the castle walls just after sunrise. They came hissing through the fog, tiny flashes in the trees below, the opening notes of a song everyone knew by heart. The defenders ducked behind stone and returned fire. Rifle cracks echoed between the cliffs, sharp and hollow. The war, which had raged for 6 long years across continents, now collapsed into one narrow valley and one ancient fortress. Captain Lee moved like a man conducting an orchestra of chaos. "Keep your heads down, fire in short bursts," he shouted. German and American voices answered as one. The irony of it was lost on no one. Lee's tank crew used Besotten Jenny as both shield and cannon, firing short, precise bursts down the slope. Spent shells clinked against the cobblestones. Inside the castle, the French prisoners were half soldiers and half spectators. General Gamelin stood at an upper window, watching with his field glasses. "They're forming up by the tree line," he said, his voice calm, analytical, as if briefing a staff meeting. Reynaud crouched beside him, reloading a rifle with clumsy fingers. "How long can we hold?" Gamelin shrugged. "Long enough for history to notice." John Barotra sprinted across the courtyard with ammunition boxes, his tennis shoes slipping on wet stone. "Think of it, my friends," he shouted, laughing over the noise. Someone yelled for him to keep his head down. He winked and disappeared up a stairway. By mid-morning, the SS began using mortars. The first shell hit the outer wall and exploded in a spray of dust and splinters. The prisoners dove for cover. Shards of old stone rained down. Captain Lee wiped blood from a cut on his forehead and shouted for the tank to rotate its turret. "Give them something to think about." The gun roared, sending a shell screaming into the trees. The explosion was answered by screams and scattered return fire. In the lower courtyard, Major Gangel moved among his men, checking positions. He wore his Wehrmacht uniform without insignia, a gray ghost among strangers. When an American private offered him a cigarette, he accepted it wordlessly. For a few seconds they smoked together, watching the gate shake under the hammering of bullets. "You know," the private said, "this is the craziest damn thing I've seen all war." Gangel exhaled smoke through his nose. "Then you have seen enough war." A lull settled around noon. The valley filled with haze. The SS had pulled back to regroup. The defenders used the pause to tend to the wounded. A French officer lay on a table in the kitchen, his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked towel. An American medic worked silently, jaw clenched. Outside, the smell of gunpowder mixed with cooking smoke from the castle's battered chimney. Someone found a pot of potatoes and started boiling them, because men cannot fight on empty stomachs. Dalliday sat on a bench, his hands trembling. "All my life," he said to no one in particular, "I feared the day the Germans would return. I never imagined I'd welcome them." The German soldier beside him chuckled softly. "We're not the same Germans, monsieur." Dalliday nodded. "No, and perhaps we are not the same Frenchmen either." The quiet did not last. Around 1 o'clock, the SS attacked again, this time from 2 sides. Automatic fire swept the walls. A sniper's bullet shattered a lantern near the gate. The defenders ducked and returned fire in controlled bursts. Captain Lee's voice echoed from tower to tower. "Hold your fire, wait for targets." The Americans were steady, the Germans disciplined. Together they made a wall of defiance. The tank took a direct hit. The shell punched through its side with a sound like thunder. Jenny groaned, then belched smoke. The crew scrambled out, coughing, their faces black with soot. Lee cursed but refused to give ground. "Use her as cover. She's done her part." They turned the burning tank into a barricade, stacking sandbags around its smoking hull. Up in the tower, Reynaud spotted movement, a group of SS soldiers crawling through the grass toward the gate. "They're coming," he shouted. The defenders opened fire. The grass erupted with dust and screams. The attackers fell back, dragging their wounded. For every step they took forward, they paid in blood. As afternoon burned toward evening, the battle became a rhythm,
Attack, repulse, reload, breathe. Smoke hung over the valley like a veil. The sun glowed faintly behind it, a dying ember. The men fought not for victory, but for survival, each second bought with courage and stubbornness. Bullets tore chips from the ancient walls, centuries of history crumbling under modern fire. In the great hall, the French prisoners huddled between volleys. Weydon sat with his back to a column, rosary beads sliding through his fingers. "I thought I understood war," he said quietly.
But this is something else. Barotra burst in, grinning despite the dirt on his face. Something glorious, perhaps? Weygand shook his head. No, something necessary. Outside, Major Gango saw movement near the ruined gate. A French general had taken cover behind a broken cart, but was exposed to sniper fire. Without hesitation, Gango ran across the open courtyard. "Stay down," he shouted in German. The sniper's shot cracked like a whip. Gango staggered, a dark bloom spreading on his neck. He fell without a sound. An American soldier dragged him into the shade, but it was already too late. Gango's eyes fluttered once, and then he was still. Captain Lee knelt beside him, jaw clenched. "God damn it, Joe," he whispered. "You picked the wrong war to be a hero." When the others learned of his death, no one spoke for a long time. Even the Frenchman, who had once cursed every German uniform, stood in silence. Reynaud removed his cap. "He was one of the good ones," he said. Lee nodded. "He was the best." The SS regrouped again at dusk. They fired mortars into the courtyard, the blasts shaking the ancient stones. Fire spread through the stables. Horses screamed. Smoke rolled across the battlements, turning the defenders into silhouettes. Lee knew they couldn't hold much longer. "If help doesn't come by nightfall," he told his sergeant, "we're done." John Barotra overheard him. "Then I'll find them," he said simply. Lee stared at him. "You're crazy." Barotra smiled. "I'm fast." He pointed to the outer wall. "I can climb it, slip through the forest, reach the road. If the Americans are anywhere nearby, I'll bring them back." Lee hesitated, then handed him a pistol. "You won't need it if you're lucky." Barotra winked. "I'm always lucky." Under cover of darkness, he scaled the wall like an acrobat, dropped into the ravine, and vanished into the trees. The defenders listened to the sound of gunfire, then silence. No one knew if he had made it through. Inside the castle, night settled like a shroud. The fires burned low. Men slept in shifts, rifles in their arms. Lee walked the battlements, counting his soldiers, German, American, French, and realized he no longer cared who wore which flag. They were brothers now, bound by the same fate. Far below, in the dark woods, John Barotra ran through mud and smoke, the sound of his own heartbeat louder than the war around him. Behind him, the castle flickered like a dying candle against the mountains. Ahead, somewhere beyond the next ridge, was salvation or death. He ran faster. The forest swallowed him whole. Every branch seemed alive, every rustle of wind a warning. John Barotra moved like a shadow, his lungs burning, his legs trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He could still hear the faint echoes of gunfire behind him, the heartbeat of the castle that refused to die. The path ahead was little more than a thread of mud between trees, invisible in the darkness. He ran anyway. Freedom had always been a race for him, and he had never lost one yet. The night was alive with strange sounds, owls calling from the trees, the distant growl of engines, the whisper of rain beginning to fall. Somewhere in the valley below, the SS were moving, their boots drumming against the earth. Barotra slipped into a ditch as headlights swept across the road, then crawled through wet grass until his fingers found gravel again. The road led west. If he could reach the American lines, he might save everyone still trapped behind the walls of Castle Itter. He thought of the men he had left behind. Dallidet with his furrowed brow, Reynaud clutching his rifle like a relic, Captain Lee shouting orders with calm fury. He thought of Gangle, the German major who had died trying to save a man he'd once been ordered to hate. And he ran faster, as if speed itself were a prayer. Hours passed. The rain came harder, cold needles against his face. His uniform clung to him like a second skin. Twice he stumbled, once falling into a ditch so deep it took him minutes to climb out. When he finally saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance, he almost cried with relief. He raised both arms and stepped into the road. The first jeep nearly shot him. The driver slammed on the brakes, soldiers jumped out, rifles raised. Barocher shouted, "American! Castle Itter! SS attacking!" His accent was thick, but the desperation in his voice cut through everything. One of the soldiers lowered his weapon. "Jesus, look at this guy," he said. They pulled him into the jeep, wrapped him in a blanket, and poured coffee into his shaking hands. When they brought him to their commanding officer, he could barely speak. The officer was a tall man with dark circles under his eyes, Captain Walker, commander of a nearby U.S. infantry unit. He listened to Barocher's broken English, the story of Americans and Germans fighting together, of French VIPs under siege. At first, he thought it was delirium. But then he saw the fire in Barocher's eyes and knew it was true. "Get your gear," he told his men. "We move now." By dawn, the reinforcements were rolling. Tanks, half-tracks, and trucks loaded with infantry thundered down the mountain road. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with smoke. Birds scattered from the treetops as engines roared below. Barocher rode in the lead jeep, drenched, exhausted, but unbroken. He pointed toward the valley. "There, the castle. You will see it soon." Back at Castle Itter, the defenders were down to their last ammunition. The SS had surrounded the hill, firing from every angle. The courtyard was a cratered wasteland. Besaden Jenny was a smoldering wreck, its metal glowing red in the morning light. Captain Lee moved from post to post, encouraging his men. "Hold the line," he shouted. "Help's coming." But even he didn't know if he believed it. In the tower, Reynaud fired his last magazine, then leaned against the wall, panting. "This is the end," he said. "Perhaps," Daladier answered beside him. "I hear engines." At first, Reynaud thought it was imagination. Then the sound grew louder, the deep, steady rumble of American armor. The SS heard it too. Panic rippled through their ranks. Some broke and ran, others fired wildly toward the sound. The defenders cheered, a hoarse, ragged sound that filled the smoke-filled air. Captain Lee grabbed his radio operator. "Get on that set. Tell them we're up here." The operator twisted the knobs, static crackling through the air. Then a voice answered, clear and strong. "Friendly armor approaching. Hold tight." Moments later, the first American tanks appeared on the road below, their guns blazing. Machine gun fire ripped through the forest. The SS tried to stand their ground, but the shock of the assault shattered them. Some fled into the trees, others dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Within minutes, the valley was filled with the thunder of liberation. From the tower, Daladier watched through tears.
"Mon Dieu," he whispered. "They came." Reynaud laughed, a sound that was half relief, half disbelief. "Yes, they came." When the tanks reached the castle gate, the defenders burst from their positions, waving and shouting. The Americans poured in, weapons ready, eyes wide at the sight before them. French generals, American soldiers, German deserters, all standing by side among smoking ruins. "What the hell happened here?" one sergeant asked. Captain Lee grinned, lighting a cigarette with hands still shaking from exhaustion. "Long story," he said. "You'll want a chair for it." The battlefield was silent now, except for the hiss of burning wood and the crackle of dying fires. Bodies lay scattered along the slope. Men who had fought for a cause that no longer existed. The defenders moved through the smoke, checking for survivors. In the courtyard, Major Gongel's body was laid out under a blanket. Lee knelt beside him, removed his cap, and whispered, "You kept your promise, Joe." The French prisoners gathered nearby, their faces hollow but proud. Reynaud looked at the fallen German and said softly, "He died a free man." No one argued. As the sun broke over the Alps, the battle was officially over. The defenders, Americans, Germans, and Frenchmen alike, stood together for a photograph no one had planned to take. Smoke drifted through the frame, sunlight glinting off rifles and helmets. The war for them had ended here, on this mountain, in this improbable alliance. For the next few hours, the castle became a sanctuary. The wounded were treated, the dead were honored, and for the first time in years, there was laughter in the halls. Borotra returned with the reinforcements, mud-streaked and grinning. "Did I keep my word?" he asked Captain Lee. Lee laughed. "You sure as hell did." Inside, the French prisoners gathered around a long table and shared the first hot meal they'd had in days: potatoes, bread, and coffee. They raised their cups in silence. Daladier spoke first. "We began this war divided," he said. "We end it together. Perhaps that is what victory really means." Outside, the Americans raised the stars and stripes over the gate, but beneath it fluttered the white flag that Gongol had used to approach them 2 days before. Lee left it there on purpose. "Let it fly," he told his men. "That flag saved more lives than any bullet." When the sun set again over Tyrol, the castle glowed gold in the fading light. The mountains were quiet. The guns were silent. The strangest battle of World War II had ended, but its echo would travel far beyond those stone walls. That night, as the survivors lay on makeshift beds, they spoke of home. The Americans talked about New York and Kansas. The Germans spoke of wives and farms. The Frenchmen spoke of Paris, of freedom, of tomorrow. None of them mentioned the past. The war had taken enough from them already. In the courtyard, under the pale light of the moon, Captain Lee stood alone for a while, listening to the wind. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he could still hear the faint clatter of hooves on stone, a ghostly echo from another age, reminding him that history never really ends. He lit another cigarette, looked up at the stars, and whispered to the darkness, "We did what we had to do." The next morning, reinforcements from the 12th Armored Division arrived to secure the area. Reporters came days later, scribbling notes and snapping photos. The story spread through the ranks like a rumor too strange to be false. Americans and Germans fighting together against the SS. Some believed it, some didn't. Those who had been there didn't care. When the war officially ended on May 8th, word reached Castle Itter by radio. The men stood in silence as the announcer's voice declared Germans' unconditional surrender. Then someone started to clap, then another. Soon the courtyard erupted in cheers and laughter and tears. The war was over. For the first time in years, the world could breathe again. But for those who had fought there, the memory would never fade. The Battle of Castle Itter was not about victory or defeat, about politics or nations. It was about men who chose decency over duty, courage over fear, humanity over hate. And though history would call it the strangest battle of World War II, those who survived knew the truth. It was the most human. Part 410. The morning after the battle, a fog of silence settled over Castle Itter. Smoke still rose from the stables, curling through broken windows like ghosts that refused to leave. The courtyard was littered with spent shells and the debris of survival. Shattered helmets, torn uniforms, rifles leaning against the walls like weary men. The war was over in this valley, but peace had not yet learned how to arrive. Captain Lee walked the perimeter, boots crunching on gravel and ash. His men were asleep wherever they had fallen, on staircases, beside sandbags, on the floor of the great hall. The French prisoners, now free men, had gathered in the chapel. They stood beneath cracked frescoes, their voices low. Someone had found candles, and their flickering light painted the faces of men who had been enemies only days before. General Weygand led them in a short prayer, not to celebrate victory, but to honor the dead. When he mentioned Major Gongol's name, even the Americans bowed their heads. Renaud whispered to Daladier, "Strange, isn't it? A German officer gives his life to save us. What kind of world have we built where such a thing must happen for us to remember we are human?" Daladier nodded slowly. Perhaps the next world will be wiser. Outside, the villagers of Itter began to climb the hill, drawn by the sound of quiet voices and the rumor of salvation. They came cautiously, carrying baskets of bread and milk, not sure whether the castle was still dangerous. When they saw the American flag fluttering beside the white banner of truce, they wept. Some crossed themselves, others simply stood and stared at the soldiers resting in the sunlight. For years they had lived under fear, under orders barked in German. Now, in the courtyard, they heard laughter in 3 languages and saw soldiers helping one another patch bullet holes in the walls. Captain Lee greeted them with a tired smile. "You're safe now," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The villagers nodded and began unloading food. An old woman pressed an apple into his hand. "For the man who stopped the killing," she said in German. Lee didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He tipped his helmet in thanks. In a corner of the courtyard, John Borotra helped an American private wash soot from the stone fountain. The water ran black at first, then clear. "You run faster than any man I've ever met," the soldier said, grinning. Borotra laughed. "I have had much practice, my friend, on tennis courts and now in wars." The secret is never to look back. Later, the French prisoners sat at a long table set up in the open air. The villagers had brought bread, cheese, and wine that had been hidden for years. For the first time since their capture, they ate without fear. Weygand raised a glass. "To Major Gangle," he said, "and to the madness that taught us mercy." The toast passed from hand to hand, from French to American to German. When it came to Lee, he hesitated. "To the castle," he said finally. "May it never see another battle." Reporters arrived within days. They took photographs of the cratered walls, of the burned-out tank still smoldering by the gate, of the strange coalition that had defended the fortress. The Frenchmen posed reluctantly, their uniforms torn, their faces lined with fatigue. The Americans smiled for the camera, though the laughter never reached their eyes. The Germans stood slightly apart, unsure whether to be proud or ashamed. In one photo, Lee stands beside Reynaud and Borotra, a cigarette between his fingers, his face unreadable. That photograph would one day hang in a museum, captioned simply, "The Strangest Battle of World War II." When the correspondents asked Lee what had happened, he shrugged. "We saw people who needed help," he said, "so we helped them. It's as simple as that." But the journalists pressed for details, for headlines, for heroes. "Were the Germans brave?" one asked. "They were human," Lee replied. "That's brave enough." The French prisoners were taken to Innsbruck 2 days later. As they prepared to leave, the villagers gathered to see them off. Daladier embraced Captain Lee, awkwardly, as if unsure of the protocol for thanking a man who had saved his life. "I will tell France what you did," he said. Lee smiled faintly. "Tell them we just did our job." Reynaud gripped his hand. "No, Captain, you reminded us what honor looks like." Borotra lingered by the gate, looking up at the mountains. "Do you think we'll ever be back here?" he asked. Lee shook his head. "If the world has any sense, no one will ever fight over this place again." The Frenchman laughed softly. "Then I hope the world has sense." After they left, the castle grew quiet again. The Americans stayed another week, cleaning up, burying the dead. They built a small wooden cross for Major Gangle near the courtyard where he had fallen. Lee carved the words himself. He fought for freedom, not for flags. When they left, the villagers promised to care for the grave. They still do. Decades later, the story of Castle Itter would nearly vanish from history books. The war was too vast, too crowded with tragedy and heroism for one small fortress to claim attention. But those who had been there never forgot. Jean Borotra returned to tennis after the war, his quick feet still carrying him across courts, though the cheers sounded different. He spoke often of that day in Austria. "We were enemies when it began," he told a reporter once, "and brothers when it ended. Perhaps that is what victory means." Paul Reynaud returned to politics, haunted by the memory of the courtyard. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Itter was a small place, but for a few hours it contained all the decency the world had left." Edward Daladier died quietly years later, his last known letter mentioning a dream in which the castle stood untouched under snow, the war forever locked outside its gates. Captain John C. Lee returned to America, where he lived a modest life, rarely speaking of the battle. When asked why, he said, "Because it wasn't really about us. It was about doing the right thing when everything else was wrong." He kept a single photograph on his wall, the white flag fluttering beside the stars and stripes. The villagers of Itter rebuilt their homes, replanted their fields, and each year on May 5th they placed flowers at the castle gate. Some of the children born after the war grew up hearing the story of the German who died saving the French, and the Americans who came to his aid. To them, it sounded like a legend, too simple and too good to be real. But the old ones would nod and say, "It happened. We saw it with our own eyes." Today, the castle still stands. The bullet holes in its walls are filled with plaster, but the stones beneath remember. The wind that moves through the valley carries whispers of 3 languages, 3 armies, and 1 brief moment of understanding. Tourists come now, climbing the same road where tanks once rolled, taking photographs of the gate, the courtyard, the towers. Some feel a chill they cannot explain. Others say they hear echoes, shouted orders, the ring of gunfire, the laughter of men who had forgotten how to laugh. It is said that at dawn, when the mist lies heavy and the sun touches the peaks, the castle glows faintly gold, as it did on the morning after the battle. Perhaps it is only light playing tricks on the eye. Or perhaps, as some locals claim, it is the memory of that strange day in May 1945, when the world briefly remembered its own humanity, and men who should have been enemies stood shoulder to shoulder for something greater than themselves. For history, the Battle of Castle Itter was a footnote. For those who lived it, it was proof that even in the last days of the darkest war, goodness could still find a way to survive. And sometimes that is enough. Before the battle, before the smoke and fire, there were long months of silence inside the castle. The walls of Itter held not only prisoners, but memories, regrets, and the slow erosion of pride. Every morning began the same way: the heavy clank of boots in the corridor, the squeal of iron doors, the bark of commands from guards who had long since forgotten why they were angry. The prisoners had learned to mark time not by calendars, they had none, but by the way the light changed in the courtyard. Edward Daladier often rose before dawn. He would stand at the narrow window of his cell and watch mist roll down from the mountains. He told himself it looked like the breath of a sleeping world, but he knew it was only fog. In those hours, before the day began, he felt closest to peace. He would think of Paris, of how people once cheered when he promised peace at Munich. He would think of how that peace had lasted less than a year. "We traded honor for illusion," he once muttered, "and found ourselves slaves of both." Paul Reynaud, by contrast, filled his days with motion. He would pace the hallway until the guards threatened to confine him again.
"If I stand still," he told Baratra, "the war will have won twice." Reynaud wrote speeches on scraps of paper torn from old SS ledgers, speeches to no one, speeches that ended with lines like, "We must rebuild, not to forget, but to remember differently." Sometimes he read them aloud in the courtyard, his voice echoing off the walls, and for a few minutes the men could almost believe they were back in the Chamber of Deputies in Paris instead of a stone prison in Austria. Jean Baratra was the youngest, and his energy annoyed the others. He organized games in the courtyard, makeshift tennis with wooden planks for rackets and a rope for a net. Even the guards watched, pretending not to smile. "We will not die like old men waiting for permission," he declared once, swinging at an imaginary serve. "We will live every minute, even in a cage." When the others grew tired of his optimism, he laughed it off. "If I cannot win a match," he said, "then I will win the day." General Gamelin spent hours drawing maps from memory. He would spread them on the floor, marking battle lines from the campaigns of 1940. He studied them with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "Here," he would say, tracing a finger along the Meuse, "here is where I should have turned the division." Weygand, sitting nearby, would shake his head. "The past has no supply lines, Maurice." But Gamelin couldn't stop himself. The war had taken not only his country, but his certainty. Redrawing maps was a way to rebuild himself. The guards, mostly young SS conscripts, grew restless as the war turned against them. They received conflicting orders from higher command, some promising transfer, others warning of punishment for desertion. They took their frustration out on the prisoners, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence. One of them, a boy no older than 19, confided to Krobot one night as they repaired a door hinge. "The Führer will save us," he said, though his voice trembled. Krobot looked at him and said nothing. He had seen the same fear in 100 faces, the fear of waking up after believing in the wrong God. Supplies grew scarce. Meals were thin soups of potato peel and cabbage. Once, the prisoners went 3 days without bread. They shared what little they had. Reynaud gave his portion to the older men. "I have speeches to eat," he joked. Weygand prayed before each meal, though he admitted later he did not know to whom. The sound of distant artillery reached them more often. The ground trembled sometimes. "They are coming," Baratra would say. "Americans, perhaps." But the others had learned not to hope too soon. Then, in late April, the guards began burning documents. Trucks arrived, loaded with crates of files marked Dachau Verwaltung. The commandant ordered them stacked in the courtyard and set ablaze. The flames roared for hours, black smoke rising like a funeral pyre. The prisoners watched through their windows, the reflection of fire flickering across their faces. "The Reich is erasing itself," Dalladea whispered. "When a beast knows it is dying, it eats its own name." A week later, one of the guards hanged himself in the barracks. No one said why. The others grew jumpy, muttering about traitors and spies. The commandant paced constantly, his uniform immaculate, even as his world disintegrated. When Hitler's death was announced over the radio, he listened in silence, then poured himself a drink and stared out the window for a long time. The next morning, he was gone. That was the day everything changed. The prisoners woke to find no orders, no guards, only silence. It was Krobot who ventured into the yard first. He returned a few minutes later, his face pale. "They're gone," he said. "All of them." At first, no one believed him. But when they stepped outside, the truth was unmistakable. The barracks were empty, the gates unguarded. Only the echo of their footsteps broke the stillness. Some laughed, some wept. Dalladea sat on the steps, head in his hands. "Freedom," he said, "and I don't know what to do with it." Reynaud climbed the tower and stared at the valley. Smoke rose from the villages below. "The war isn't over," he said quietly. "Not yet." Weygand called them all inside. "We must plan," he said. "Freedom without direction is suicide." That night, they gathered in the dining hall by candlelight. "We cannot stay," Reynaud insisted. "The SS will return. They will kill us for being witnesses." Gamelin disagreed. "Leave and we die in the woods." The argument grew heated. Then Krobot, who had been silent, spoke. "There are Americans nearby. I can find them. Let me go." The Frenchmen exchanged glances. "It's suicide," Dalladea said. Krobot shrugged.
So is waiting. He left before dawn, pedaling into fog thicker than smoke. They watched him vanish down the mountain road, the faint squeak of the bicycle fading into silence. And then they waited, hour after hour, day after day, unsure whether to hope or mourn. During those 2 days, time warped inside the castle. The prisoners took turns on watch, rifles in hand, staring down into the valley. They slept in shifts, ate what little food remained, and flinched at every sound. On the second night, they heard gunfire far off, maybe from Wurgel. He found someone, Aratra said, or they found him. No one replied. The next afternoon, footsteps echoed on the path. They rushed to the walls, weapons raised. Through the mist came shapes, first one, then several. The white of a flag, a truck, men in gray and khaki, and the face of Krobot, alive. "Help!" he shouted. "I brought help!" That moment, before the first shot of the coming battle, was perhaps the most beautiful of their lives. The gates swung open, the convoy rolled in, and the impossible alliance began. The Frenchmen could not yet know that within 48 hours they would fight side by side with the very army that had once conquered them. They did not know that courage could wear so many uniforms. All they knew was that the war was still raging outside their walls, and that inside, for the first time in years, hope was no crime. Long before they ever reached Castle Itter, the German soldiers who would one day fight beside the Americans were already living in quiet rebellion. Major Joseph Gangel's unit had once been a proud artillery detachment in the Wehrmacht, loyal and efficient. They had fought through France, the Balkans, and finally back into the collapsing heart of Germany. But by 1945, the war had drained them of belief. The Reich was a corpse, and its orders smelled of rot. Gangel himself was not an ideologue. He had joined the army before Hitler's rise, back when the uniform still meant service to a country, not to madness. He believed in duty, in discipline, in protecting the innocent. But as the years passed and the crimes grew, his faith faltered.
In Normandy, he had seen villages burned to the ground as reprisal. In Poland, he had heard whispers about camps where people vanished without trace. Each rumor was a stone on his conscience. By the spring of 1945, stationed in the Tyrol region, Gangel's unit was little more than a skeleton crew, tired men who wanted to go home, who no longer saluted with conviction. The SS patrols nearby frightened them more than the Americans did. Those black uniforms represented something unholy, a devotion to destruction. Gangel began working quietly with the Austrian resistance, smuggling information and weapons, helping civilians escape summary execution. Every time he did, he knew discovery meant death. One evening in late April, he met with the leader of the local resistance, a schoolteacher named Alois Meyer. They sat in the cellar of an abandoned inn, a single candle between them. "The Americans are near," Meyer whispered. "If we hold out a few more days, it will be over." Gangel nodded, but didn't smile. "Over for whom?" he asked. "For us? For the civilians? The SS will kill as many as they can before they're finished." Meyer's hands trembled. "Then we must stand between them and the people." Gangel looked at his reflection in the dark glass of a bottle. "Then I suppose that's what we'll do." When the Yugoslav cyclist arrived at Wurgel with his desperate plea, Gangel saw it as both an opportunity and a duty. The thought of French VIP prisoners, unarmed and trapped, surrounded by fanatics, awakened something in him that war had not yet destroyed. "We will help them," he said, and though some of his men protested, none refused. Perhaps they saw in his resolve the only meaning left to cling to. The men he chose were a mix of veterans and boys barely out of school. Corporal Fritz Meyer, no relation to the teacher, was the most skeptical. "You expect us to join the Americans?" he asked. "They'll shoot us before we can speak." Gangel's reply was simple.
Then we'll die telling the truth." The young corporal didn't argue further. When they reached the outskirts of Kufstein and encountered the American patrol, tension nearly exploded. Rifles aimed, shouts in 2 languages, the smell of fear thick in the air. But when Captain Lee stepped forward, face grim, weapon lowered, and said, "Talk fast, Major," the bridge between enemies began to form. Gangel's honesty was his weapon. "We have no time for lies," he said. "The SS are planning to kill men who should have been prisoners, not corpses." Lee looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Get in. Let's end this thing." That alliance, born in the ruins of war, felt unreal even to those who forged it. As the convoy rolled toward Itter, Gangel glanced at the Americans in the jeep ahead of him. They joked quietly, unaware that the man sitting behind them had once fired shells at their comrades. He wondered if they would still joke if they knew how many battles his guns had helped win for the Reich. But guilt was a luxury he couldn't afford now. He was fighting for redemption, not remembrance. In the back of the truck, his men spoke in low voices. One of them, a mechanic named Ernst, said, "Do you think they'll forgive us after this?" Another laughed bitterly. "No one forgives Germans anymore." Gangel turned in his seat. "Then we'll forgive ourselves," he said, "by saving whoever we can." Silence followed. In that silence, something shifted. They were no longer soldiers of a dying empire. They were men trying to make peace with their souls. The road climbed steeply, twisting through forests heavy with mist. They passed abandoned outposts, overturned wagons, and the corpses of deserters hanging from trees. SS justice carried out even as the Reich disintegrated. Gangel ordered his driver not to look. "Eyes forward," he said. "We're not part of that anymore." When the castle finally came into view, perched on its cliff like a sleeping giant, the men fell silent. The French prisoners had hung lanterns in the towers, their faint glow in the dusk. It looked more like a monastery than a fortress, yet they all knew death waited inside its walls. "So, this is where we make our stand," Gangel said quietly. Lee grinned beside him. "You picked a hell of a last job, Major." After the battle, the surviving Germans would tell anyone who asked that they never doubted the decision. But the truth was, each of them had felt fear unlike any before. To fight alongside the enemy was treason beyond imagining. Yet, as the first bullets cracked the morning air, the fear vanished. Combat erases questions. In those frantic hours, they forgot who wore which insignia. A rifle was a rifle. A man was a man. Corporal Fritz Meyer would later recall seeing an American private pinned behind a wall, his ammunition gone. Without thinking, Meyer had thrown his own spare magazine to him. "Catch," he shouted in English, the word clumsy on his tongue. The American nodded, reloaded, and kept firing. When it was over, they met in the courtyard and shook hands without speaking. They didn't need to. After the surrender, when the Americans took over the valley, the surviving Germans were offered safety. Some chose to return home, some to remain in Austria. None of them were prosecuted for their part in the war. Their cooperation had bought them more than survival. It had bought them a kind of grace. Gangel, of course, never saw it. His death had sealed their redemption. When they buried him, his men stood at attention beside the Americans, their rifles reversed in mourning. Captain Lee spoke a few quiet words, then stepped aside to let a French general place flowers on the grave. "He died a soldier," Lee said later, "but more than that, he died a man." Years afterward, the town of Wurgo would name a street after Josef Gangel. On a plaque below his statue, the inscription reads, "Starb für die Freiheit, nicht für ein Reich." He died for freedom, not for a Reich. The people who walk that street today may not know his story, but the mountains remember. Every spring, when the snow melts from the peaks and the rivers roar with thaw, the sound carries faintly down the valley, like distant gunfire fading into peace. The Germans who fought at Castle Itter were never officially recognized by their former army, nor by the victors. Their courage existed in a gray space, too inconvenient for propaganda. But perhaps that is fitting. They were men of twilight, fighting not for glory, but for redemption, standing between the dying night and the first light of dawn. In that light, for one brief moment, the lines blurred, and the world seemed possible again. In the days before help came, the French prisoners endured a kind of waiting that ate into the bones. The castle became an island of unease, adrift in a sea of chaos. Each man tried to make sense of his fear in a different way.
Daladier retreated into quiet contemplation, pacing beneath the archways, counting his steps as though rhythm could hold back despair. Reynaud argued with invisible ministers, rehearsing speeches he would never give. Gamelin and Weygand, enemies in politics and temperament, began to speak like brothers, bound by failure and survival. At night, when the fires outside dimmed and the guards' boots faded from the corridors, they gathered in the great hall. The walls were lined with faded portraits, barons, bishops, women in silks long turned to dust. Their painted eyes watched the living huddle around a single candle. "When this is over," Daladier said once, "France must learn humility." Reynaud laughed bitterly. "France will learn hunger first." Borotra, restless as ever, could not sit still. He walked the ramparts, listening to the wind claw at the stones. He thought of the tennis courts at Roland Garros, the roar of crowds, the flash of white lines under summer sun. It felt like another life. Sometimes he swung an invisible racket through the air, pretending the whistle of wind was applause. He knew it was foolish, but he needed it. Hope, even foolish, was better than silence. The prisoners heard rumors through the guards before they fled. Whispers that Hitler was dead, that the Allies were across the Inn River, that the SS was executing anyone who spoke of surrender. Each rumor was a spark, quickly smothered by fear. "If he is dead," said Weygand one evening, "then the men who loved him will kill twice as many to prove he lives." No one contradicted him. When the commandant disappeared and Crobat volunteered to ride for help, they argued fiercely. "He'll never make it," Gamelin said. "He'll be caught before he reaches the valley." But Crobat only smiled. "Then I will die outside, not here." His courage embarrassed them. Daladier pressed a small gold pin into his hand. "Bring this back to me," he said, "so that I may believe in miracles again." After he left, the emptiness of the castle deepened. The prisoners heard birds for the first time in months. The sound felt wrong, almost indecent. "Freedom has a strange accent," Reynaud muttered. The hours crawled. They took turns watching the road through borrowed binoculars. The mist never lifted. Even the mountains seemed to hold their breath. That night, a storm broke. Lightning flashed over the valley, illuminating the forest in ghostly blue. Thunder rolled across the peaks. The Frenchmen huddled near the fireplace, flinching at every boom that sounded too much like artillery. "Perhaps this is the end," Daladier whispered. "Perhaps God is clearing his throat." Weygand answered, "If he is, I hope he has better generals than we did." When the SS came back into the valley, they brought the storm with them. The first shots at dawn startled even the ravens. The men scrambled to the walls, rifles shaking in their hands. "How many?" Reynaud shouted. Gamelin peered through the scope. "Too many," he said simply. The echoes of battle swallowed the rest. Inside the castle, fear was replaced by a strange calm. It was as if the long months of waiting had burned away the capacity to feel. Each man found purpose in motion. Daladier carried ammunition, Reynaud loaded rifles, Weygand, too old to fight, prayed aloud until his voice broke. Borotra moved between towers, urging them on. "Hold fast," he cried, "the Americans will come." But even as he said it, he wondered whether the Americans knew they existed. When Captain Lee and his men arrived with gang, the relief was physical, like air rushing into lungs starved too long. For the first time, they saw uniforms that did not belong to the Reich.
The sight of the white star painted on the tank's hull brought tears to Daladier's eyes. He gripped Lee's hand and said, "If you are a dream, don't wake me yet." During the battle that followed, the French prisoners became soldiers again. Years of politics and blame dissolved in gunpowder. They fired from windows, shouted orders, carried the wounded. At one point, Reynaud found himself crouched beside a German corporal, both aiming at the same target. Their eyes met. The German nodded once before squeezing the trigger. Reynaud never learned his name. After Gang's death, something shifted in them all. They no longer fought merely to survive. They fought to honor him. "He died for us," Dallamier said as he reloaded. "Then we must make his death count." Barotra, bleeding from a graze on his arm, laughed through his pain. "It already counts, my friend. The world will remember this day." When the reinforcements finally arrived and the shooting stopped, silence filled the castle again. But it was a different silence now. It was full of breath, of heartbeat, of life. The men walked through smoke and rubble as if stepping out of a dream. Reynaud found Gang's body and knelt beside it. "You fought better for France than some Frenchmen did," he said softly. That night, when they gathered in the great hall again, they lit candles not for prayer, but for remembrance. The war outside still roared, but here, in this fortress of stone and memory, something new had begun. Weygand looked at the flickering flames and said, "We have survived. Now we must learn what to do with survival." No one answered. They were all thinking the same thing. That survival is its own kind of burden. That freedom, after so much captivity, can feel like vertigo. And yet, as the first light of dawn crept through the broken windows, they realized they were no longer prisoners of anyone. Not of the Reich, not of fear, not even of the past. The road from Castle Itter to Innsbruck wound through valleys still scarred by the retreat of a broken army. Burned trucks lay half sunk in ditches, bridges sagged under the weight of wreckage, and every field seemed to hold the ghost of a battle. The convoy moved slowly. 2 American jeeps, a few trucks, and 1 battered ambulance carrying the wounded. The French prisoners rode among soldiers who just days before had been their jailers. The silence between them was strange, but not hostile. It was the silence of men who had shared too much to need words. Captain Lee led the column. His face was grim, eyes sunken from exhaustion, but there was a kind of lightness in his shoulders. Behind him sat Daladier, Reynaud, and Barotra wrapped in borrowed coats. As they descended the mountain road, the world seemed to open before them, a vast patchwork of fields, rivers, and distant villages under the pale gold of spring sunlight. Somewhere down there, the war was ending. When they reached Wurgel, they found the townspeople waiting. Word of the battle had spread faster than any radio. The villagers came out of their houses carrying flowers, bread, and bottles of schnapps. They cheered as the vehicles rolled through the square. "Danke, danke," they cried. Lee raised a hand in acknowledgement, but did not stop.
He had orders to deliver his passengers to Allied headquarters, and he meant to see it done. At the edge of town, they passed the spot where Major Gangel had been buried. Someone had already placed fresh flowers on the mound. Barotra asked to stop the jeep. He stepped out, knelt by the grave, and touched the wooden cross. "You kept your promise," he whispered. "Now I must keep mine." He took off his cap and stood for a long moment before rejoining the convoy. In Innsbruck, Allied command received them with disbelief. The idea that Americans, Germans, and French VIPs had fought together sounded like a fable. "You're telling me you defended a castle with Wehrmacht troops?" an intelligence officer asked Captain Lee. "That's right," Lee said, "and it worked." The officer stared at him for a moment, then laughed. "You boys have a strange sense of humor." Lee didn't laugh back. "Tell that to the men we buried." The French prisoners were given quarters in a requisitioned hotel. They slept for 12 hours straight, waking to clean sheets and hot food for the first time in years. When they gathered in the dining room the next morning, the mood was surreal. Outside, American soldiers marched past in formation. Inside, former statesmen tried to remember how to be free. Reynaud ran his hands over the white tablecloth. I had forgotten the feel of linen, he said softly. I had forgotten we were human. Over the following days, Allied officers interviewed them one by one. They asked about their captivity, the treatment of prisoners, the role of the SS. They took notes, nodded gravely, promised that justice would come. But the Frenchmen's minds were elsewhere. We have seen justice already, Daladier said. It lies in a grave on a hill above Wurgel. Barotra was the first to leave, hitching a ride with an American convoy bound for Paris. As he climbed into the truck, Captain Lee shook his hand. "You run fast, John," he said. Barotra smiled. "Only when history is chasing me." They laughed, and for a moment the war felt far away. In Paris, Barotra became a symbol of resilience. The newspapers called him the hero of Itter. He told the story often, but always the same way. There were no heroes, he said, only men who remembered, too late, what it means to be human. When a journalist asked whether he would ever play tennis again, he replied, "Perhaps, but now I play for ghosts." Reynaud and Daladier returned to France together. The crowds that greeted them were polite but subdued. France was free again, but it was a freedom heavy with guilt. Collaboration, betrayal, survival, all had blurred into one long shadow. The men who had once ruled the nation were now symbols of its broken pride. Yet, when they spoke of the war, they always mentioned one name, Itter. It was the day, Reynaud wrote, when France's enemies became her protectors, and we learned humility among ruins. In Austria, Captain Lee remained for several months, overseeing the demobilization of German forces and the transition to peace. He visited the castle once more before leaving for home. The walls were quiet, the courtyard overgrown with weeds. The villagers had repaired the gate, patched the bullet holes, and hung a wooden sign that read simply, May 5, 1945, when enemies became allies. Lee walked the empty corridors and felt the echoes of footsteps long gone. In the great hall, he found a single chess piece lying on the floor, a white knight carved from bone. He slipped it into his pocket. "A good reminder," he murmured. "Even knights need saving sometimes." When he returned to America, he refused promotions and medals. He married, worked in a small-town post office, and never boasted of what he had done. When reporters came asking for stories, he pointed them to the men in France. They were the ones worth writing about, he said. Yet, in quiet moments, he would take out the chess piece and turn it over in his fingers, remembering the sound of gunfire echoing through the Alps, the face of the German major who had died under the same flag. Decades later, the survivors gathered once more in Austria. It was 1965, the 20th anniversary of the battle. The castle had aged but endured. The mountains were the same, eternal and indifferent. Reynaud was there, older, frailer, his voice softer. Barotra came, his hair silver, his stride still quick. A small crowd of villagers joined them, along with a few American veterans. They stood in the courtyard where the tank had burned, where Gangle had fallen, where the white flag had fluttered against the smoke. Reynaud spoke briefly. "We came here as prisoners. We leave as witnesses. This place is proof that even in madness, men can choose mercy." A priest blessed the sight. Children from the village laid flowers. Someone began to sing a hymn, and others joined in, their voices rising into the clean mountain air. The song was not about victory or loss, it was about endurance. That evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, Barotra stood alone by the wall. "Do you ever wonder," a young journalist asked him, "why this story isn't better known?" He smiled faintly. "Because people prefer simpler stories, good against evil. But here," he gestured to the mountains, "we learned that even in evil there can be good." The journalist looked at him curiously. "And what did it cost you?" Barotra thought for a long moment before answering. "Everything I believed about enemies." When the visitors left, the castle fell silent again. The grass grew where blood had once soaked the soil, the bullet holes weathered smooth. But some nights, when the wind swept down from the mountains, the villagers swore they could still hear voices. American, German, French, mingling in laughter that sounded like forgiveness. The war had ended, but the story of Castle Itter remained a quiet reminder of what peace demands. Not just the silence of guns, but the courage to look an enemy in the eye and see a man instead of a monster. Time, more relentless than war, moved on. The guns fell silent, the uniforms were folded away, and Europe began to rebuild. But memory is a strange thing. It lingers in the cracks, in the quiet, in the faces of men who can never quite forget. For the survivors of Castle Itter, peace was not an ending, but a long reckoning. Paul Reynaud returned to the Chamber of Deputies, older and thinner. The applause of the assembly could not erase the echo of gunfire in his ears. He spoke often of unity, of rebuilding France as a nation of conscience rather than pride. We must remember, he told his colleagues, that even in our defeat we were saved by the hands of those we called enemies. Some listened, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In politics, moral clarity is rarely welcome. Yet Reynaud carried that conviction to his last day. On his desk, among papers and speeches, stood a small photograph of the castle. Beneath it, in his own handwriting, were the words, May 5, 1945, proof that decency is stronger than fear. Édouard Daladier retired quietly. He never sought public office again. In his final years, he lived in a small house near Avignon, surrounded by books and silence. Visitors sometimes asked him about Munich, about mistakes and lessons. He would listen patiently, then say, I have been both prisoner and free man, and I tell you this, freedom means nothing if it cannot forgive. On his mantle lay a stone he had taken from the courtyard of Itter. When he died, it was buried with him. Jean Borotre became a symbol of post-war France, not just for his athletic glory, but for his defiance of despair. He toured Europe speaking about courage and reconciliation. We cannot play forever on the court of hate, he would say, standing before crowds of students. We must change the game. When he returned to Castle Itter for the anniversary, he walked the same battlements he had once patrolled with a rifle. The air smelled of pine and rain. I can still hear them, he told a reporter, the voices of men who refused to be enemies. The villagers of Itter never forgot either. They kept the graves tended, the castle preserved. Each spring, on the anniversary of the battle, they climbed the hill carrying flowers and candles. Children read aloud the names of the fallen, American, German, French, without distinction. Their parents stood behind them, remembering the days when the valley shook with thunder. For them, history was not a chapter in a book. It was a neighbor buried in the soil. In Germany, the story of Major Joseph Gang remained almost untold for years. The new republic had little appetite for tales that blurred the line between guilt and redemption. But in Virgil, his name endured. The townspeople built a small memorial by the roadside, a simple plaque beneath a maple tree. It read, Here feel Major Joseph Gang, a German who remained human. Decades later, historians would rediscover his story and call him the Good German. But the people of the valley never needed the label. They had seen his goodness with their own eyes. Captain John C. Lee lived out his life in quiet anonymity. He never returned to Europe. In his hometown in Tennessee, he worked at a small bank, raised 2 children, and rarely spoke of the war. Once, at a veterans gathering, someone asked him what his proudest moment had been. He thought for a while, then said, "The day I realized the world didn't have to be divided by flags." His daughter would later find a box of mementos in his attic, letters, medals, and one chess piece shaped like a knight. On a slip of paper taped inside the lid, he had written, "Castle Itter, don't forget what men can be." As the decades passed, history moved on to larger stories: Normandy, Stalingrad, Hiroshima. The small fortress in the Tyrol faded from textbooks, surviving mostly in footnotes and veterans' tales. But for those who had lived it, the memory remained sharp as the crack of a rifle. It was a reminder that even in the final hours of the world's darkest war, something brighter had flickered to life, a fragile, defiant humanity. In the 1980s, a historian named Stephen Harding began researching the battle. He traveled to Austria, interviewed aging witnesses, and uncovered forgotten records. What he found astonished him. Not myth, but truth. The story of Castle Itter was not a legend, but a miracle of circumstance and courage. When his book was published, readers were stunned. "It sounds like fiction," one reviewer wrote, "but perhaps that's what makes it so true." Television crews came next, filming documentaries that walked the same paths through the forest, the same roads once marked by tank tracks. They found the bullet scar still visible on the outer walls, faint but stubborn. They filmed the courtyard at dawn, when light poured over the battlements like memory returning to a forgotten dream. The world finally took notice, briefly, before turning away again to newer tragedies. Yet the castle endures. Tourists climb its winding path, breathing the thin alpine air, unaware that every stone beneath their feet was once witness to history's strangest truths. Sometimes they see the memorial cross by the gate and pause to read the inscription. Fewer still understand what it means. That in the final hours of a collapsing empire, decency and courage had refused to die. For Europe, the lesson of Itter was subtle but enduring. It whispered through the halls of post-war diplomacy, through the creation of a new order, where nations once divided by hate learned to build together. Never again, they said, and perhaps they meant it. Perhaps, in some small way, the ghosts of that castle had taught them how. Each year, when the snow melts from the Tyrolean peaks and the grass turns green along the battlements, a few locals gather at the site. They light candles, place wildflowers on the walls, and stand in silence as church bells echo through the valley. No speeches, no flags, only remembrance. They say that as the wind rises, it carries faint voices, an American laugh, a German command, a French prayer, all blending into one. The war ended long ago, but the meaning of Castle Itter has never faded. It remains a quiet truth hidden in the noise of history, that sometimes, in the very heart of darkness, men remember the light. And when they do, the world, for a fleeting moment, becomes something worth saving again. The castle stands still. Time has not conquered it, only softened its edges. Moss grows where fire once burned. Ivy winds across the same stones that echoed with gunfire and shouts. Tourists arrive with cameras and bottled water, reading plaques that spake of bravery and strange alliances. They nod, they take photos, they leave. But if they linger long enough, if they listen when the wind turns, they might hear it, the heartbeat of the past, steady and stubborn beneath the quiet. The Valley of Itter has changed little since 1945. The same green fields stretch to the horizon. The same river threads silver through the meadows. The mountains watch from a distance, ancient and impassive. Yet for those who know, this is sacred ground. Not for conquest, not for victory, but for the moment when humanity remembered itself. Each May, a few survivors' families still visit. The descendants of Captain Lee, of Major Gang, of Jean Borotra walk together up the road to the gate. They bring flowers, American lilies, French roses, German edelweiss. They do not wear uniforms. They do not carry flags. They stand together before the weathered cross that marks the spot where Gang fell, and they share a silence that needs no translation. It is the kind of silence that feels alive, humming with gratitude and grief in equal measure. The caretaker of the castle, an old Austrian named Heinrich, greets them each year.
His father had been a child during the battle, hiding in the cellar of their farmhouse when the guns thundered. He told me, Heinrich says softly, that the mountains shook that day. But afterward they were quiet, as if they too were tired of hate. He runs his hand over the stone wall, the rough texture familiar after decades. This place reminds us, he adds, that not all Germans were monsters. Not all Americans heroes, not all Frenchmen victims. They were simply men. In one corner of the courtyard stands a small plaque installed by the town of Virgil. Its inscription is worn but clear. Here, on May 5, 1945, men of three nations, American, German, and French, stood together against tyranny. They fought not for flags, but for one another. May the world remember and never forget. The sun catches on the letters, and for a brief moment they glow gold, as if lit from within. In Paris, the archives of war hold dusty folders labeled Itter Castle Incident. Bureaucrats pass them by. Historians occasionally open them. Journalists rediscover them every few years. The reports are factual, methodical. Troop numbers, times, casualties. They do not mention the laughter that followed the last shot, the shared bread, the tears shed for a German major by men who once called him enemy. Paper is too thin for that kind of truth. In America, a few history enthusiasts keep the story alive. They write articles, record podcasts, and give lectures to students who stare wide-eyed, struggling to imagine a world where enemies fought together. It wasn't strategy, one lecturer says. It was conscience. And conscience is rarer than victory. In Virgil, school children learn about Major Gengel as part of their local history. They visit his statue every spring. Some touch the bronze hand for luck before exams, whispering the old legend that courage can be borrowed from the past if your heart is steady enough. The teachers tell them that bravery is not loud. It is quiet, stubborn, and often alone. As for the castle itself, it has seen other owners, other seasons. It was restored, abandoned, restored again. Tourists climb its towers and gaze at the mountains, unaware that beneath their feet lie layers of unspoken history. Yet sometimes, when clouds gather and the air grows still, the courtyard seems to hum with energy, like an orchestra tuning before a song only ghosts can play. Inside, a few relics remain: a fragment of the burned tank's armor plate, a rusted rifle, a dented helmet with faded paint. They sit behind glass now, tagged and numbered. But the true relics are invisible. They live in the memories passed down through families, in letters kept in drawers, in stories told softly over dinners and campfires. They live wherever people choose mercy over revenge. One of Captain Lee's grandchildren once stood at the castle gate and asked Heinrich, the caretaker, "Do you believe they knew what they were doing that day? That it would matter?" Heinrich smiled. "No," he said, "they just did what was right. The meaning came later." The meaning always comes later. History is written by survivors, but truth belongs to witnesses, the ones who see not just the battle, but the moment after, when silence settles and men must decide what it all meant. The witnesses of Castle Itter are gone now, but their decision remains, carved into the stones, that even at the end of the world, decency is worth dying for. As evening falls, the castle turns to shadow. The last rays of sunlight catch the flagpole, where once two banners flew side by side, the stars and stripes, and a white cloth of truce. The colors are gone, but in memory they still wave together in the alpine wind. Below, the valley grows quiet, the river whispering to itself as it has for centuries. In that whisper lies the lesson of Itter, that humanity, fragile and flawed, is capable of extraordinary grace. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to obey it. And that sometimes the smallest acts of honor, shared bread, a risk taken, a single life saved, shine brighter than any victory parade. The war is over. The world moves on. But in one forgotten castle in the mountains of Austria, the story remains, waiting for anyone willing to listen. And when you stand there, feeling the wind against your face, you understand why it matters. Because in a century of darkness, there was one day, one impossible luminous day, when men remembered who they were. The strangest battle of World War II was not about armies. It was about souls. And in that battle, humanity won.